Eric XIV of Sweden was supposed to be a success story. He was the firstborn son of Gustav Vasa, the founding father of modern Sweden. He was educated, intelligent, fluent in languages, and even something of a poet. On paper, he should have been remembered as Eric the Great. Instead, he's remembered as the Mad King poisoned by peas. Yes, peas. A vegetable side dish became his fatal legacy. But to understand how a king ended up as a punchline of culinary history, we need to rewind to the beginning. Eric was born in 1533, at a time when Sweden was breaking away from Denmark and Norway. His father, Gustav Vasa, had pulled Sweden out of the Kalmar Union with grit, politics, and a lot of violence. Gustav was a stern man, not prone to coddling his children. Eric grew up in a court where betrayal was always possible and power was always fragile. It's no wonder the boy developed a suspicious streak. As a young man, Eric was ambitious. He had big dreams for Sweden, to make it a real European power. He courted foreign princesses, including Elizabeth I of England, sending her gifts and letters in hopes of winning her hand. Elizabeth, who had half the crowned heads of Europe proposing to her, politely declined. For Eric, the rejection stung. Imagine shooting your shot with the Virgin Queen and getting left on read. Not great for the royal ego. When Gustav died in 1560, Eric took the throne. At first, things looked promising. Sweden was growing stronger in the Baltic, and Eric had vision. He styled himself as more than a Scandinavian king. He wanted to be a European player, but almost immediately, cracks began to show. Eric's problem wasn't a lack of intelligence. He was smart. His problem was instability. His mood swung wildly. Sometimes he was charming, witty, generous. Other times, he was brooding, paranoid, and terrifying. He suspected everyone of plotting against him. Nobles, brothers, even servants. In a kingdom where loyalty was already fragile, paranoia was like pouring oil on fire. The tension boiled over with his own family. Eric had half-brothers, John and Charles, and like most royal brothers, they weren't exactly the Brady Bunch. John especially was ambitious, and when Eric discovered John had negotiated with Poland behind his back, he locked him up in a dungeon. Nothing says healthy sibling relationship like prison chains, but the real tipping point came with the Sture Murders in 1567. The Stures were a powerful noble family, and Eric convinced himself they were plotting against him. So he arrested several of them. Then, in a fit of rage, he personally stabbed Niels Sture to death and ordered executions of the others. Witnesses described the king covered in blood, eyes wild, robes stained red. It was horrifying and unforgettable. A king murdering nobles with his own hands? That was not in the royal handbook. From then on, Eric's reputation collapsed. The nobility feared him. Foreign ambassadors called him unstable. The people whispered about their mad king. And Eric? He doubled down. He prowled Stockholm in disguise, convinced he could catch conspirators gossiping in taverns. Picture the king of Sweden in a fake mustache, lurking in the corner of a bar, eavesdropping on fishermen. It's absurd, but it happened. And then in the middle of all this chaos, Eric did something nobody expected. He married for love. Not to a princess, not to a noble, but to Karin Månsdotter, a commoner and former servant. She was the daughter of a prison guard. The nobility nearly choked on their wine. A queen with no pedigree? Outrageous. But Eric adored her. For once, his decision wasn't driven by paranoia or ambition, but by affection. Karin, by all accounts, was gentle, calm, and a stabilizing presence. For a while, she softened him. But politically, the marriage was dynamite. By 1568, Eric's enemies had had enough. John escaped prison, Charles sided with him, and together with angry nobles, they launched a rebellion. Eric, abandoned by most of his allies, was captured. The king, who had once dreamed of marrying Elizabeth III and turning Sweden into a European powerhouse, now found himself locked away in castles, shuttled from one prison to another like a dangerous criminal. And that brings us to the peas. Eric spent the rest of his life under guard, increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid. He scribbled notes about poison, refused meals, and muttered about conspiracies. In 1577, he was served pea soup. According to legend, it was laced with arsenic. He ate, fell ill, and died. Later forensic tests on his remains showed high levels of arsenic and mercury. Whether it was murder or medicine gone wrong, one fact remained. Peas were his last supper. It's a ridiculous end. Kings are supposed to die in battles, or at least in bed, surrounded by courtiers. Eric XIV died in prison, felled by vegetables. History, with its cruel sense of humor, made him unforgettable. But Eric's story isn't just about peas. It's about what happens when paranoia rules a throne. He was intelligent, ambitious, and even visionary, but he couldn't master himself. His instability destroyed his relationships, alienated his nobles, and plunged Sweden into chaos. He set the stage for his own downfall. The peas were just the punchline. If Eric XIV's reign had been a play, the final act after the poisoned peas would have been Karin Månsdotter's quiet survival. While Eric raged and unraveled, Karin endured. And unlike so many queens caught in political storms, she didn't end on the executioner's block or in permanent exile. She lived. More than that, she lived with dignity. Karin's story fascinated the people of Sweden. She had been a servant, the daughter of a prison guard, with no noble blood, no political connections, and no claim to power. Yet she became queen. To ordinary Swedes, her story was almost like a fairy tale. Proof that even in the rigid hierarchies of the 16th century, love could upend the rules. While nobles sneered, peasants admired her. After Eric's downfall, Karin was spared. She accompanied him for part of his imprisonment, even sharing the harsh conditions, but eventually she was allowed to live independently with their children. While Eric descended into paranoia, Karin became a symbol of stability. Folk songs, poems, and legends cast her as the innocent caught in the whirlwind of a mad king's downfall. In a saga filled with blood and absurdity, she was the soft note of humanity. Eric, on the other hand, remained the boogeyman of Sweden's memory. His reign was remembered not for his foreign policy or his early ambitions, but for his paranoia and the Sture Murders. Imagine being one of Sweden's aristocrats in the decades after Eric. Every time a monarch acted high-handed, you'd remember the king who stabbed nobles in a fit of rage. His madness didn't just end his reign. It scarred the monarchy's relationship with the nobility for generations. The irony, of course, is that Eric wasn't entirely wrong about being surrounded by enemies. His brothers were conspiring. Nobles did hate him. But instead of balancing politics, Eric let paranoia consume him. He became the very thing he feared, the justification for rebellion. When John and Charles moved against him, even Eric's loyalists abandoned ship. Who wants to fight for a king who might stab you at dinner? And then there's the peas, the detail that turns Eric from just another failed monarch into one of history's unforgettable oddities. Death by peas sounds like a Monty Python sketch, not a royal epitaph, but that's the point. History remembered the absurd. Whether or not the peas were truly poisoned with arsenic, whether it was murder or medicine, doesn't matter. What mattered was the story. It stuck. In Sweden's cultural memory, Eric became the Mad King poisoned by peas. Plays, poems, and later novels leaned into that tragicomic image. He wasn't remembered for policies or wars, but for madness and vegetables. And that, in its way, is justice. Power-hungry monarchs want grand legacies, empires, monuments, conquests. Eric got peas. But if we look deeper, Eric XIV's story teaches some hard lessons about leadership and power. Absolute monarchy, by its very design, depends on the personal stability of the king. If the king is wise, the nation benefits. If the king is paranoid, the nation suffers. Eric's reign showed what happens when unchecked authority magnifies personal flaws. His moods became policies. His suspicions became arrests. His rage became bloodshed. And yet, it's too simple to dismiss Eric as just a lunatic. He was educated, multilingual, even visionary. He wanted Sweden to matter in Europe. He reached for Elizabeth I's hand. He dreamed of greatness, But dreams don't matter if you can't master yourself. Eric's tragedy was that his inner demons dictated his destiny. He had the tools for greatness, but none of the discipline. That's why his story resonates today. Strip away the 16th century robes, the castles, the poisoned peas, and you're left with something timeless. The danger of power without restraint. Leaders, whether kings or presidents or CEOs, are still human. Their flaws, paranoia, insecurity, rage, can still warp institutions and ruin lives. Eric XIV just had the misfortune of living in an age where one man's madness was everyone's crisis. So when we remember him, maybe we should laugh, because peas are ridiculous. But maybe we should also reflect, because his downfall wasn't just absurd, it was catastrophic. Nobles murdered, trust shattered, a dynasty shaken. Eric XIV gave Sweden chaos, and Sweden responded by erasing him from power. He was brilliant and broken, ambitious and paranoid, a poet and a murderer. Eric XIII wanted to be remembered as a great king of Europe. Instead, he is remembered as the mad king poisoned by peas. History, with its cruel sense of humor, turned his tragedy into a punchline. And perhaps that's the final lesson. That power without control always ends in downfall, sometimes with blood, sometimes with laughter, and sometimes with something as small, as absurd as a bowl of peas. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more tales of kings and queens who ruled with brilliance, madness, and sometimes just very bad luck.